Why is it such a struggle for me personally, not just for people out there, but for me, to be heavenly minded in the way that I ought to be? There are so many different reasons why we struggle to be heavenly minded. And not only are there many different factors, but they really cover the gamut of Christian experience. And the more I got to thinking about that, the more I realized that there are all these different answers to the question, why is it hard to be heavenly minded? That's when I got to thinking I want to have a go at writing something on that. And so the book as it came to be is in two parts. Part one of Setting Our Sights on Heaven is the part that's meant to lay the foundation. So there are 4 chapters in there in which we go over what the Bible has to say about heaven. Not just heaven as it is right now, that unseen realm to us where Christ is and where the believers who have died have gone to be, but also heaven, we might say capital H heaven, the new world that Christ is going to usher in after He comes back. And so in part one, we look at that teaching in the Scriptures about heaven as it is now, the new world as it's going to be after Christ comes back. And then we think about what it means to be heavenly minded, that we ought to be a people who think about that, who think about our hope, and who do so as those who are oriented toward that world, who do so as those who are longing for that world, and as those who are living out that expectation, and as those who are praying about that expectation and saying, "Come, Lord Jesus." And then part 2 is 9 chapters, and each one of those chapters takes on one particular factor that might make it hard for us to be heavenly minded as we ought to be. So there's a chapter about the doubts that we might have as to whether or not we're going to reach heaven. And what's the answer? The answer is the gospel. That God keeps His own, He preserves His own so that they persevere in the faith throughout this life. And that God is the one who justifies, so that we don't have to cower in fear that our good works won't be good enough to get us into heaven, because it was never the gospel that our good works would get us into heaven, but that Christ's works get us into heaven. There's a chapter about public worship on the Lord's Day. Maybe we don't think about heaven as much as we could because we haven't made the most of the heavenly character of our gathering for worship on Sunday. And so the emphasis on that chapter is on seeing heaven in our Sunday worship service. There's a chapter on the Bible's teaching about hell, because that's another factor. We might not be as heavenly minded as we ought to be because we can't come to grips with what the Bible teaches about hell. And if you start thinking long and hard about heaven, you're eventually going to come around to the Bible's teaching about hell. And so we need to take a sober and faithful look at what the Bible has to say about that as well. So there are 9 chapters in part 2. That's just a sample. There are others. All of these different factors that can make it hard to be heavenly minded. And I think they run the gamut of Christian experience because heaven touches down everywhere in Christian experience. That's just the nature of the Christian life. It is the heavenly life being lived in advance. And so, to the degree that we're not really heavenly minded, well, to that degree, our Christian life even now is going to be thin, it's going to be impoverished. And that's why I think it's so important for us to rise up and meet these challenges.